A hired wagon creaked up the switchback. Inside sat a quiet bride he bought but didn't want, carrying a secret ready to gut his solitary life. Amos pinched the match out. The sulfur sting caught in the back of his throat, harsh and familiar. He thumbed the spent wood over the porch rail, watched it land in a patch of dirty snow. 50 miles from the nearest railhead, 10 from a neighbor. He wasn't a man who needed company. The pines provided enough noise when the wind tore through the canyon, and the creek, currently a slow, dark vein running under a crust of November ice, gave him all the water he required. He checked the action on his Winchester out of habit. The lever operated smoothly, heavily oiled. The weight of the walnut stock against his shoulder was a familiar comfort, a tangible thing, predictable. Women were not predictable. Yet here he was, standing on a porch he built with his own 2 hands, waiting on a wagon driven by a half-blind teamster, delivering a woman he knew only from 2 letters written on cheap mercantile paper. Why did he do it? Winter was coming, a hard one. The woolly bears were solid black this year, and the deer pelts were thick enough to stop a knife. He needed hands, someone to tend the stove while he ran the deep woods trap lines, someone to salt the meat and keep the cabin from turning into an icebox. Utility. That was the rationale he fed himself when he wired the money to the agency in St. Louis. A transaction, nothing more. The wagon finally broke the tree line. 2 exhausted bay horses pulling a buckboard that had seen better decades. Hiram, the driver, sat hunched in a buffalo coat. He looked like a pile of rags left out to freeze over a fence post. The wagon wheels screamed against the frozen ruts, grinding ice and rock into powder. Amos stepped off the porch. The mud in the yard was hard as cast iron, gripping the soles of his boots with every step. He didn't wave, didn't smile. He merely stood near the hitching post, his thumbs hooked loosely in his gun belt. Hiram pulled back on the reins. The horses blew violently, expelling thick clouds of steam. Their flanks were lathered, shivering uncontrollably as the frigid wind hit the sweat. "Got her?" Hiram grunted. His voice sounded like gravel rattling in a tin pan. Amos didn't look at the driver. His eyes shifted immediately to the canvas flap at the back of the wagon. It trembled. A pale hand emerged from the gap, knuckles white, clutching the rough fabric as if it were a lifeline. Then, a boot. Thin leather. Entirely useless for this elevation, she stepped down. Josephine, that was the name on the contract. She wasn't tall. She wore a wool dress dyed a muted, practical gray, heavy with 3 days of road dust. Her coat was criminally thin, a frayed woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her neck, hiding the lower half of her face. She didn't look up at the mountains. She didn't look at the cabin. Her gaze remained fixed on the deep ruts in the frozen mud at her feet. She carried one bag, a carpet bag with a busted brass clasp tied shut with a piece of frayed hemp twine. "Much obliged, Hiram," Amos said. His voice was a low, grating rumble, entirely unused to the open air. He dug into his coat pocket, flipped a leather coin purse to the driver. Hiram caught it with a heavy mitt, weighed it in his palm, and nodded once. Without a single word to the woman he'd hauled up the mountain, Hiram snapped apparatus. The wagon groaned in protest, turned in the tight clearing, and started the slow, treacherous descent back toward the valley. Amos stood there, Josephine stood there. 10 feet of frozen earth stretching between them. The wind howled down from the jagged ridge above, biting violently through denim and wool. Josephine shivered. A sudden, violent, full-body tremor that rattled her shoulders. Amos offered no welcoming speech. No inquiries about the long journey. He spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dirt near a stump. "Grab your bag," he said. "Stove's lit." He turned his back on her and walked up the wooden steps. A test. If she expected him to carry her things, she'd learn quickly how this mountain worked. He listened closely as he reached the door. A moment of hesitation. Then the soft, scraping scuff of her thin boots on the timber stairs behind him. Inside, the cabin was a single large room. Utilitarian to its core, it smelled of wood smoke, oiled leather, cured meat, and old coffee. A massive cast-iron stove dominated the center of the floorboards, radiating a dry, aggressive heat. A heavy log bed sat in the far corner, a table built from rough-hewn pine, 2 mismatched chairs, a rack holding a double-barrel shotgun, and a skinning knife. Nothing soft. Nothing meant for comfort. She stopped just inside the doorway. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, cutting off the howl of the wind. The sudden absence of the gale made the silence in the cabin absolutely deafening. Amos walked straight to the stove, grabbed a grease-stained rag, and lifted the blackened coffee pot. He poured a dark, sludgy stream into a tin cup, set it on the table with a dull clank. "Drink," he said. She finally looked up. Her eyes were a pale washed-out blue, intensely guarded, like a trapped fox calculating the distance to the open door. She moved stiffly, favoring her left side. She dropped the carpetbag near the wall, took the cup with both hands, letting the residual heat seep into her frozen, red fingers. She didn't drink, just held it, staring into the black liquid. Amos watched her from the shadows near the back wall, leaning against the timber. He noted the way she kept her shoulders hunched, actively minimizing the space she took up. She wasn't shy. Shy was a luxury for town girls who had parlor rooms to hide in. This was something else entirely. This was a finely tuned survival instinct. "Take off the coat," Amos said. He unbuttoned his own heavy canvas jacket. "You'll sweat. Then you'll freeze to death when you go back out to the privy." She stiffened. Her hands tightened around the tin cup until her knuckles popped audibly in the quiet room. She set the cup down on the table with excruciating care. Slowly, she unwrapped the shawl. Then, her stiff fingers went to work on the buttons of the thin coat. She moved with deliberate caution. When the coat finally slipped off, Amos saw the frame beneath the gray dress. Too thin. Sharp hollows at her collarbones visible even through the high collar. But it was her posture that held his attention. Rigid. Braced, waiting for an impact. Amos frowned. He walked past her, his heavy boots thudding on the floor. He grabbed a split log from the pile near the door and shoved it hard into the stove. The fire snapped loudly. A shower of sparks hit the iron. She flinched violently, a sharp, ragged intake of breath tearing through her throat. She took a half-step backward, bumping into the table. He closed the iron door with a heavy clatter. "I ain't gonna hit you," he said. It wasn't a reassurance. It was merely a statement of geographical fact. He didn't waste energy on violence without a reason. She stared at the stove, her chest rising and falling too fast. "They all say that," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, dry as saddle leather. Amos didn't reply. He didn't care about the they. He cared about the firewood, the perimeter traps, the low-pressure system moving in over the peaks. He pointed a thick, calloused finger to a wash basin in the corner. "Clean up if you want. Beans are in the pot. Bread's in the tin." He grabbed his rifle from the rack and a cardboard box of shells. "Where are you going?" The panic in her voice was sudden, sharp and unhidden. "To check the snare line down by the creek," he said, pulling the heavy door open. The biting cold rushed back in, instantly killing the warmth in the room. "I'll be back afore dark. Don't let the fire die." He shut the door, leaving her entirely alone in the unfamiliar, suffocating heat. The afternoon bled into early evening. The sky turned the color of bruised iron, heavy with impending snow. Amos moved through the timber with practiced, absolute silence. The cold was a physical weight now, pressing against his lungs with every breath. He found a snowshoe hare in the third snare, its neck broken clean by the wire. A good, quick death. He freed the carcass, tied the hind legs to a leather thong on his belt, and kept moving. His mind, usually focused on tracks and wind direction, kept drifting back to the cabin, to the woman standing rigidly by the stove. He hadn't wanted a complicated arrangement. He wanted a working partner for the homestead, the letters she had sent, or that the agency had penned on her behalf, spoke of a widow from Ohio, capable of hard labor, looking for a quiet life. Looking at her, Amos didn't see a widow seeking peace. He saw a fugitive running from a war zone. He crested the ridge above his cabin. Smoke curled steadily from the stone chimney, a thick gray ribbon cutting against the darkening sky. She hadn't let the fire die. Small victories. Amos walked down the slope, his boots crunching loudly through the frozen crust of the earth. He paused by the woodpile, grabbing a massive armful of split pine. He kicked the door open with the heel of his boot. The cabin was suffocatingly warm. It smelled heavily of heated beans and the faint, coppery scent of the dead hare hanging from his belt. Josephine was sitting at the table. She jumped violently when the door banged open, her hand instinctively flying to her lap. She had been sewing something, or mending. She quickly shoved the fabric into the deep pocket of her canvas apron, an apron she must have pulled from her bag. Amos dropped the wood by the stove. The logs hit the floorboards with a heavy thud. He tossed the dead hare onto the butcher block near the washing basin. "Got meat for tomorrow," he said. He shrugged off his coat, hanging it on a wooden peg by the door. He washed his hands in the freezing water of the basin, scrubbing the dirt and faint blood from his skin with a block of lye soap. Josephine sat perfectly still, watching him. Every single movement he made was being logged, analyzed, and filed away in whatever shattered survival mechanism she operated on. Amos dried his hands on a towel. He grabbed 2 tin plates from a shelf and moved to the stove. He ladled the thick, unappetizing beans onto the plates, adding a thick slice of dense, dry bread to each. He set one plate down in front of her, then took his own and sat heavily in the chair opposite. He didn't pray, he just started eating. She picked up her fork. Her hand trembled slightly. She ate mechanically. There was no enjoyment in it, just fueling the engine to keep it running. The silence stretched between them, thicker than the massive log walls holding up the roof. The only sounds were the scrape of tin, the chewing of tough bread, and the whistling draft under the door. "The roof," she said suddenly. Amos stopped chewing. Looked at her. The wind catches a loose shake on the east corner, makes a terrible racket, she clarified. Her eyes remained firmly fixed on her plate. "I know," Amos said, swallowing the heavy food. "Nail won't hold in the rotted wood up there. Needs a whole new board. I'll cut one when the mill thaws in spring." She nodded once. The conversation died instantly. Amos finished his meal, scraping the tin plate completely clean. He pushed back his chair. The harsh scrape of the wood against the floorboard sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Josephine froze again, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. "I'll skin the hare," Amos said. He noted her reaction but ignored it entirely. "You wash the plates." He moved to the butcher block, unsheathed his skinning knife. The blade caught the dim, flickering light of the kerosene lamp. He worked with brutal, practiced efficiency, slitting the hide down the belly, peeling it back over the legs like a tight glove. The visceral, wet sound of tearing tissue and snapping cartilage filled the room. Josephine stood by the wash basin. Her back was to him. She washed the tin plates in the cold water, but her shoulders were rigid, locked tight. She was listening to the knife, to the tearing flesh. Amos finished the job, tossed the guts into a tin bucket for the hogs, and hung the red carcass on a hook near the door to drain. He wiped the blade clean on a rag and slid it back into the leather sheath on his belt. Night had fully settled over the mountain. The wind picked up significantly, howling against the exterior logs, rattling the loose shake on the roof, just as she had noted. Inside, the heat from the stove made the air thick and heavy. Amos pulled a bottle of cheap rye from a shelf, poured a single finger into a clean tin cup. He didn't offer her any. He sat in the chair by the stove, stretching his long legs out toward the heat. He grabbed a tin of bear fat and began working grease into his leather boots. Josephine finished the dishes. She dried her hands thoroughly on her apron. She stood in the center of the room, completely unsure of where to exist in this space. "Sit," Amos said, without looking up from his boot. She moved to the chair at the table, sat perched on the very edge of it, ready to bolt. "Bed's yours," Amos said. His voice was flat, transactional. "I'll take the pallet on the floor." She finally looked at him. The pale blue eyes were wide now, shocked. "You bought me," she said. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Amos kept aggressively rubbing grease into the leather, his thumbs pressing hard into the seams. "I paid for a wife to work the claim, not a whore. You sleep in the bed." A complicated, fractured emotion crossed her face. Relief, perhaps. But it was entirely overshadowed by deep, entrenched suspicion. She didn't trust it. She didn't trust him. Men didn't pay money for nothing. "I can sleep on the floor," she offered, her voice tight, defensive. Amos stopped his work. He looked at her, really looked at her this time, the dark, bruised shadows under her eyes, the specific, guarded way she held her left arm pressed tightly close to her ribs. "I said, the bed is yours." The tone brooked absolutely no argument. It wasn't an act of kindness. It was an order. She swallowed hard, nodded slowly. Amos finished the first boot, set it down, started on the second. "Tomorrow, you'll learn the stove. It burns hot, then it dies fast. You gotta feed it every 2 hours, day and night. You don't, we freeze in our sleep. Understood?" "Yes." "You know how to shoot?" She hesitated. A fraction of a second too long. "A little. Tomorrow you learn to shoot my way. Bears are hungry this time of year. Wolves, too. You don't go to the privy without the shotgun. Ever." He finished the boot, wiped the excess grease on his pants, stood up. The cabin felt claustrophobic suddenly, pressing in on him. He walked to the single window, peering out into the absolute suffocating blackness. The cold radiated violently through the thin glass, chilling his face. "You got a secret, Josephine?" Amos said quietly, his breath fogging the pain. He heard the sharp, frantic scrape of her chair as she stood up. "I don't know what you mean," she lied, perfectly. Amos turned around. "You walk like you got cracked ribs. You flinch when I move too fast. You hide things in your apron when I walk in the door. I don't care what you did back east. I don't care who you crossed. But up here, secrets get people killed. If someone's tracking you, I need to know. If you're sick, I need to know." She stood by the table, trembling, not from the cold. "Nobody is tracking me," she whispered. "Then what is it?" Amos took one slow step toward her. She backed up instantly, her hip hitting the edge of the table hard. Her hand flew up to her chest, a defensive primal gesture to protect her center. "Don't," she pleaded. Amos stopped. The exasperation flared in his chest, hot and acidic. He wasn't a violent man, but he had absolutely no patience for theatrics. Survival required clarity. "Fine," he said, turning away in disgust. "Keep it. But if it jeopardizes this cabin, I'll put you back on Hiram's wagon next time he comes up the pass. You can take your chances in the valley." He grabbed a heavy wool blanket from a cedar chest and threw it on the floor near the stove. He unbuckled his heavy gun belt, laying the holster within arm's reach on the floorboards. He walked over and blew out the kerosene lamp. The room plunged into darkness, save for the dull, angry red glow radiating through the stove's iron grate. "Go to sleep," Amos ordered the darkness. He lay on the hard floor, listening. The wind battered the cabin walls with increasing violence. The loose shake rattled rhythmically, a steady, maddening drumbeat. He heard the rustle of coarse fabric as Josephine moved toward the bed in the far corner. He heard the creak of the rope matrix beneath the mattress. Sleep didn't come. Amos stared at the ceiling beams, barely visible in the dim red light. He was angry. Angry at himself for bringing a stranger into his sanctuary. Angry at her for bringing the complicated, messy reality of the outside world with her. An hour passed. The fire began to die down, the temperature in the room dropping noticeably. Amos threw the heavy blanket off and stood up in his long johns. He padded silently across the floorboards to the woodpile, grabbed 2 small logs, and opened the stove door. The sudden burst of bright orange light illuminated the entire cabin. He froze. Josephine wasn't in the bed. She was sitting on the floor in the far corner, tightly wedged between the log wall and a heavy oak trunk. Her knees were pulled sharply to her chest. She was fully dressed, coat, boots, and all, staring at him with wide, unblinking eyes. Amos shoved the wood into the stove and closed the door quickly, casting the room back into heavy shadows. "What are you doing?" he asked. His voice was a harsh, gravelly whisper. She didn't answer. Amos crossed the room. His bare feet made absolutely no sound on the wood. He stopped 3 feet from her. "I told you to take the bed." "I can't," she choked out. The sound was ragged, broken. Amos frowned deeply. He knelt down, keeping his distance, resting his forearms on his thighs. "Why?" She shook her head. A violent, desperate motion in the dark. "You'll change your mind." "About what? About—" She swallowed a sob, fighting it down forcefully. "About the floor. When you want what you paid for, if I'm in the bed, it's easier for you. If I'm in the corner, I can fight." The words hit Amos like a physical blow to the sternum. The air rushed out of his lungs. He sat back heavily on his heels, staring at the small, terrified shape in the shadows. He had lived a hard life. He had seen men die of gangrene, freeze to death in snowdrifts. He had killed men over disputes that mattered less than dirt. But the raw, bleeding expectation of sheer brutality in her voice disgusted him. It disgusted him because it indicted every man she had ever known, and now, by simple proximity, it indicted him. "I told you," Amos said, his voice dropping an octave, steadying into something rock-solid. "I bought hands for the claim. Not a whore." "I'm not?" she started, then stopped. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the screaming wind outside. "You're not what?" Amos prompted. He refused to let it go. This was the infection. It had to be lanced now, or it would rot them both before spring. Josephine let out a long, shuddering breath. Her hands slowly unclasped her knees. She reached up with trembling fingers and began to unbutton her coat. "Stop," Amos said immediately. "It's freezing over there." "You wanted to know my secret," she said. Her voice was eerily calm now, the horrifying calm of a cornered animal giving up the fight, baring its throat. She pulled the coat open. Underneath, her gray dress was already unbuttoned at the top. She reached behind her neck and pulled at a set of heavy cloth ties. She shrugged the dress off her shoulders, letting the heavy wool fall to her waist. Amos averted his eyes, looking firmly at the floorboards between them. "Put your clothes on, Josephine." "Look," she commanded. The sudden, desperate authority in her broken voice forced his gaze up. She was wearing a coarse cotton chemise, but it was unlaced down the center. She pulled the fabric apart, exposing her chest and ribs to the dim red light bleeding from the stove. Amos stopped breathing. Her torso was a canvas of atrocity. Deep, ugly purple and yellow bruises mottled her ribs, some swelling clearly masking older, poorly healed fractures. But the bruises weren't the worst of it. Branded directly into the flesh, just below her left collarbone, a massive, jagged scar stood out. It was shiny, puckered, and brutally thick. Letters burned into her skin with a hot branding iron. Cattle marks. Amos felt the sudden, sharp, metallic taste of adrenaline flood his mouth. His fists clenched involuntarily at his sides, his fingernails biting into his palms. He looked up at her face. Her pale eyes were locked onto his, completely devoid of tears now, waiting for the revulsion, waiting for the anger, waiting for him to stake his own claim on the ruined property. "My husband," she said, her voice flat, entirely detached from the horror she was displaying. "Jedediah Tolliver. He ran cattle down in the Panhandle. When I tried to leave the first time, he made sure I wouldn't try again without folks knowing exactly who I belonged to." Amos stared at the brand. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it defied the brutal logic of the mountains. A bear killed to eat, the winter killed without malice. This was deliberate. This was sport. "How did you get away?" Amos asked. His voice sounded hollow in his own ears. "He got drunk, passed out in the barn. I took a pitchfork to his knee, took his horse, rode to a rail town, paid an agency with his own gold eagle coins to send me as far north as they could." She pulled the chemise closed tightly, clutching the fabric securely to her throat. "I'm not a widow, Amos. I'm a runaway wife, and he's a man who hunts what he owns. If he finds out I'm here, he'll burn this cabin down with you inside it just to watch the smoke." She waited for the inevitable eviction, waited for him to point to the door. Amos looked over his shoulder at the firelight flickering through the grate. He looked at his Winchester rifle leaning against the log wall. He looked back at the woman huddled in the corner, shivering violently in the freezing cabin air. He didn't offer pity. Pity was utterly useless up here. Pity didn't chop wood or butcher meat. Pity didn't stop a lead bullet. He stood up slowly. He walked over to the bed, grabbed the heavy patchwork quilt, and walked back to the corner. He dropped the heavy quilt over her shivering shoulders, covering her entirely. "J.T., Amos muttered, tasting the letters, letting the name settle into the ledger in his mind. "Yes," she whispered, pulling the quilt tight around her neck. Amos walked back to the stove. He opened the iron door, grabbed the iron poker, and stirred the embers violently, until they roared into a small, fierce blaze. He stood there for a long time, watching the heat consume the pine. The revelation hadn't just changed the arrangement. It had fundamentally shattered the quiet, isolated life he had meticulously built for a decade. He had bought a ranch hand and inherited a war. He turned back to her. She was still watching him from the corner, a small, frightened lump under the heavy quilt. "Tomorrow," Amos said, his voice devoid of emotion, cutting through the silence of the cabin like a rusted crosscut saw. "We zero the sights on the Winchester. If JT comes up my mountain, he's gonna find out this ain't the Panhandle. And out here, I'm the only thing that bites." He walked back to his pallet on the floor, lay down, closed his eyes. "Sleep in the corner if you want," he said to the darkness, "but tomorrow you pull your weight." Silence held the room for a long minute. Then the soft rustle of fabric, the quiet pad of bare feet on cold wood, the creak of the rope matrix. Josephine got into the bed. Amos listened to the wind. The loose shake rattled. He didn't sleep. He lay there until dawn, calculating angles of approach to the cabin, inventorying ammunition, and wondering how a man survives a winter when the cold outside is the least of his problems. The mountain had just gotten a lot more dangerous, and for the first time in 10 years, Amos found himself entirely awake to the fact. This fire is burning down to embers, but the night is far from over. If you want to sit with us a while longer and hear how the rest of this hard winter unfolds, leave a like and subscribe. Share this with folks who know what it means to weather a long storm. We gather around these stories to remember we aren't surviving out here entirely alone. The trail picks up soon. Don't let the fire die out before then. The first blizzard hit 3 days later. It did not arrive with a howl, but with a suffocating, heavy silence that buried the cabin in 4 feet of dense white powder by morning. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the perimeter of the timberline, the path Amos dug to the privy, and the woodpile. They settled into a brutal, necessary rhythm. Survival in the Kai country left absolutely no room for this or polite distance. You worked or you died. Josephine took over the stove. She learned its temperament exactly as Amos had instructed. She learned which split of pine burned fast for boiling water, and which dense knot of oak would hold a coal bed through the dead hours of the night. She baked hardtack. She salted the venison Amos dragged in from the deep snow. She did not complain when her hands cracked and bled from the lye soap and the freezing water. Amos watched her. He noted the subtle shifts. The sharp hollows at her collarbones began to fill out on a diet of heavy meat and beans. The violent flinch that possessed her whenever he moved too quickly slowly faded into a cautious, calculated watchfulness. She stopped hiding in the corners of the room. She began to occupy space. On the first clear day in December, the sky a brittle, blinding blue, Amos handed her the Winchester. They stood behind the cabin, the snow packed hard beneath their boots. The air was so cold it burned the lining of their lungs with every breath. Amos had propped a split log against a snowbank 50 yards away. He had nailed a piece of charred tin to the center. "Rifle's heavy," Amos said, stepping back, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Don't fight the weight. Let your skeletal structure hold it, not your muscles. Muscles get tired. Bones don't." Josephine lifted the gun. The walnut stock was cold even through her heavy mittens. She braced the steel crescent butt plate against her shoulder. It was awkward. Her left arm, still guarding the healing ribs beneath her heavy coat, trembled under the length of the barrel. "Pull the stock tight into the meat of your shoulder," Ape Moss instructed, his voice flat, devoid of coddling. "If you leave a gap, it'll kick like a mule and break your collarbone." She adjusted her stance, pulling the rifle in hard. "Sight alignment," Amos continued, stepping to her side, looking down the barrel from a few inches away. "Front post sitting dead center in the rear notch. Level. Don't look at the target. Look at the front sight. The target should be blurry." She squinted. Her breath fogged the cold steel of the receiver. "Now the trigger," Amos said. "Don't pull it. Squeeze it slow, like you're wringing the last drop of water from a rag. It should surprise you when it goes off." Josephine inhaled sharply, held it. Her finger tightened on the curved metal. The rifle roared, a deafening crack that shattered the mountain silence. A cloud of acrid, gray sulfur smoke erupted from the muzzle. The recoil shoved her violently backward. She stumbled, her boots slipping on the packed snow, but she didn't fall. She caught her balance, the heavy rifle lowered but still gripped tightly in her hands. Ape Moss looked downrange. The charred tin remained completely unmarked. A puff of snow exploded 3 feet to the left of the log. "Flinched," Amos said. Josephine lowered her head, panting slightly. The smell of burnt powder hung heavily between them. "It's loud. Loud doesn't kill you," Amos said, taking the rifle from her hands. He racked the lever, the spent brass casing ejected, spinning through the air and landing in the snow with a soft hiss. He handed the weapon back. "Load another. Do it again." They stood out there for 2 hours. Josephine fired until her shoulder was a single throbbing ache, and her ears rang with a high, persistent whine. On the 12th shot, the charred tin chimed with a sharp metallic spang. The heavy lead slug tore a jagged hole clean through the center. Amos spat tobacco juice into the snow. Better. It was the highest praise he offered. As January bled into February, the cold deepened, turning the trees brittle. They snapped in the dead of night, sounding like artillery fire echoing down the canyon. Inside the cabin, a quiet, unspoken truce solidified into something resembling trust. They spent the long, dark evenings in shared silence. Amos sat by the stove, mending traps, oiling leather, sharpening knives. Josephine sat at the table, repairing their heavy wool socks, patching canvas, reading from a battered Bible she had brought with her, not for devotion, Amos gathered, but simply for the comfort of words. He didn't ask her about JT again. He didn't ask about Ohio, or the cattle ranch in the Panhandle, or the specific night she took a pitchfork to a man's knee. The brand on her chest was a map of where she had been. He only cared about where they were now. One night, the wind rattling the loose shake on the roof, in a frantic rhythm, Amos looked up from his whetstone. "Your ribs?" he said, his voice cutting through the hiss of the boiling kettle. "They still pain you?" Josephine paused her stitching. She looked at him, the kerosene lamp casting long, warm shadows across her face, only when it drops below zero. Amos nodded once. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy glass jar. He set it on the table and pushed it across the rough-hewn pine boards. "Bear grease and willow bark," he said, returning his attention to the knife blade sliding against the stone. "Boiled it down last fall. Rub it into the skin. It draws the deep ache out of the bone." Josephine looked at the jar. It was ugly, practical medicine, a dark, pungent paste. She reached out and took it. Her fingers traced the heavy glass rim. "Thank you, Amos," she said quietly. He didn't reply, just kept working the blade against the stone. Shh, shh, a steady grounding sound against the chaos of the winter outside. He had bought hands for the claim. But he was beginning to realize he had acquired a partner. March brought the thaw. The deep snowpack began to rot from the bottom up, turning the mountainside into a treacherous, sliding mess of mud and ice. The creek broke its frozen crust, roaring with snowmelt, a violent, muddy torrent tearing through the canyon. Amos smelled the mud and the wet pine, standing on the porch, feeling the first marginal shift in the wind that didn't carry the threat of frostbite. The trapping season was ending. The survival season was giving way to the working season. He walked down the ridge to check the perimeter snares one last time. The ground was soft, sucking at his boots with every step. Halfway down the slope, near a thick stand of blue spruce, Amos stopped dead. The mud was deep and churned. He knelt, a massive footprint, too large to be a wolf, too flat to be a bear. It was a horse. Shod. 3 of them, moving single file up the switchback. And beside the lead set of tracks, a distinct boot print. Heavy heel, a deep, crescent-shaped indentation behind the heel where a rowel spur dragged through the muck. Mountain men didn't wear spurs. They caught on the underbrush. Cattlemen wore spurs. Amos didn't run. Running wasted energy and invited panic. He stood up, unslung his Winchester from his shoulder, and walked back up the ridge with long, ground-eating strides. The ledger was finally open. He kicked the cabin door open. Josephine was at the stove, lifting a cast-iron skillet. "Put the fire out," Amos said. She froze. The tone of his voice was absolute, stripped of all casualness. It was the voice of a man who had seen the wolf. "Amos, put it out, now, then grab the shotgun." He moved to the table, dumping a box of .44-40 cartridges onto the wood. He began shoving rounds into the Winchester's loading gate with rapid, mechanical precision. Josephine didn't ask questions. She dropped a heavy lid over the stove's draft, choking the oxygen. She grabbed a bucket of melted snow water and dumped it straight into the firebox. A massive cloud of gray steam and ash erupted into the room, hissing violently. She walked to the rack and took down the double-barrel shotgun. She broke the action, verified the 2 brass shells were seated in the breeches, and snapped it shut. "How many?" she asked. Her voice didn't shake. The winter had forged the panic out of her. 3 horses, Amos said, grabbing his heavy canvas coat. Spurs on the boots. Josephine's face drained of color, turning a stark porcelain white. Her hand tightened on the grip of the shotgun. "You stay away from the windows," Amos ordered. "You find a corner where the logs are thickest. If the door opens and it ain't me, you pull both triggers and you don't stop to see what you hit. Understand? Where are you going?" "Outside," Amos said, shoving a handful of spare cartridges into his coat pocket. "I don't fight in a box." He stepped out the door and pulled it shut behind him. The afternoon air was damp and heavy. Amos moved quickly, abandoning the porch. He waded into the thick brush flanking the clearing, moving 50 yards uphill into a dense cluster of massive boulders left behind by a prehistoric glacier. It offered perfect cover, a clear line of sight to the cabin yard, and absolute concealment. He waited. The mountain dripped with snowmelt. 10 minutes later, he heard the heavy, sucking sound of hooves in the deep mud. They crested the ridge. 3 men on exhausted, mud-caked geldings. The men wore heavy canvas dusters saturated with rain and melting snow. 2 were hired guns, carrying repeating rifles across their saddle pommels. their eyes constantly scanning the tree line. The third man rode in the center. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a flat-brimmed Stetson pulled low. He rode with stiff, unnatural posture, favoring his right leg. A heavy brace of leather and iron, strapped around his knee, was visible over his denim trousers. J.T. He pulled back on the reins, halting his horse at the edge of the clearing. He looked at the cabin, looked at the dead chimney. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. "Josephine!" J.T. shouted. His voice was a booming, arrogant baritone. It echoed off the canyon walls. "I see you stopped running, girl. And you found yourself a nice little woodpile to hide in." Silence from the cabin. "You cost me a lot of money, Josie," J.T. yelled, urging his horse a few steps closer. The hired guns fanned out slowly, one to the left, one to the right. "And you cost me a good knee." "I told you property doesn't walk away, not unless I sell it." Amos leveled the Winchester over the cold granite of the boulder. He ignored J.T. The talker wasn't the immediate threat. He sighted the hired gun on the left, front post dead center in the rear notch. The target was sharp. Amos squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. The heavy lead slug tore through the wet air and struck the rider square in the chest. The man was dead before he heard the gunshot, violently thrown backward out of his saddle. His horse reared, screaming in panic. Bolting into the trees, the clearing exploded into chaos. The second hired gun kicked his horse behind the woodpile, throwing himself out of the saddle and racking his rifle. J.T. cursed loudly, pulling a heavy Colt revolver from his hip and firing wildly into the tree line where the shot had originated. Bark shattered above Amos's head, raining sharp wooden shrapnel down his neck. Amos worked the lever, ejecting the brass, chambering another round. He shifted his aim to the woodpile. The second gunman leaned out, trying to draw a bead on the boulders. A deafening roar erupted from the cabin. A massive cloud of white smoke blew out through the shattered glass of the side window. A spread of heavy buckshot tore across the yard, splintering the top logs of the woodpile and shredding the gunman's left arm. The man screamed, dropping his rifle in the mud. Josephine had not stayed in the corner. Amos didn't hesitate. He stood up from behind the boulder, leveling the Winchester at the wounded man, and fired a single shot to the center of mass. The man collapsed, face first, into the freezing muck, and stopped moving, 2 down. J.T. realized instantly his distinct tactical disadvantage. He spurred his horse viciously, driving the beast directly toward the cabin porch, aiming for the blind spot beneath the window. He hit the ground running, his bad knee buckling slightly, but adrenaline and rage pushing him forward. He slammed his shoulder into the heavy oak door. It didn't yield. "I'll burn you out, you stupid bitch!" J.T. roared, kicking at the door with his good boot. "I'll skin whoever you got in there, and I'll brand your face next." Amos vaulted over the boulder. He hit the muddy slope running. He didn't fire. J.T. was pressed too close to the cabin wall, the angle too tight. Amos hit the bottom of the slope just as J.T. turned, and J.T. raised the Colt, firing a snap. Shot. The heavy bullet tore through the sleeve of Amos's canvas coat, burning a line of fire across his bicep. Amos didn't flinch. He didn't break stride. He closed the distance in 3 massive steps, slamming the heavy walnut stock of the Winchester directly into J.T.'s jaw. Bone shattered with a sickening crunch. J.T. went down hard, dropping the revolver. Amos stood over him, breathing heavily. The mountain air was thick with the smell of black powder, wet mud. J.T. rolled over, spitting teeth and blood into the mud. He looked up at Amos. There was no fear in his eyes, only the arrogant, bewildered fury of a man who firmly believed he owned the world. He reached down his boot, pulling a heavy Bowie knife from a sheath hidden beneath the knee brace. He lunged upward, driving the blade toward Amos's groin. Amos sidestepped, the heavy mud slowing his pivot. The knife sliced through his denim trousers, opening a shallow, stinging gash on his thigh. Amos dropped the empty rifle. It clattered against the porch steps. Amos reached to his belt, drawing his own skinning knife in a single fluid motion. He didn't step back. He stepped in. He caught JT's wrist with his left hand, his grip like a blacksmith's vise locking the man's arm out. With his right hand, Amos drove his knife upward, under the ribs, plunging the blade to the hilt directly into JT's chest. JT gasped, a terrible, wet sound. The fight instantly drained out of him, replaced by the shocking, icy realization of his own mortality. His hand opened. The Bowie knife fell into the mud. Amos twisted the blade once, severing the artery, and yanked it out. JT fell backward, his head striking the wooden steps of the porch. He stared up at the gray March sky, his chest heaving once, twice, and then stopping altogether. Silence rushed back into the canyon, broken only by the roar of the swollen creek and the ragged sound of Amos breathing. Amos wiped the bloody knife on his pant leg. He sheathed it. He stooped down, picked up his Winchester, and racked the lever to clear the action. The heavy cabin door unlatched. Josephine stepped out onto the porch. She held the smoking shotgun, broken open, entirely empty. She looked at the dead man at the woodpile. She looked at the dead man in the mud. Finally, she looked down at the steps. She stared at JT. Her face was an unreadable mask. 10 seconds passed. The ghost that had haunted her steps hunched her shoulders and forced her into the freezing corners of the night lay bleeding out into the mountain dirt. Amos watched her. He waited for the tears, waited for the collapse. Josephine took a deep, steadying breath. She didn't cry. She stepped over JT's body, her boots hitting the mud. She walked over to Amos. She looked at the blood soaking through his torn sleeve and the red stain spreading on his denim thigh. "You're bleeding," she said. Her voice was steady, grounded. "Not bad," Amos replied, his voice a low gravel rumble. "Mud stops it fast enough," she nodded. She looked out at the 2 riderless horses, grazing nervously near the edge of the timber. "We can sell the gear. But we gotta dig the graves deep. Ground's soft enough now, but the wolves will dig 'em up if we don't go down at least 6 feet. Amos looked at her, really looked at her. The woman who had stepped off Hiram's wagon in November was gone. She had burned away in the wood stove, frozen out in the blizzards, and bled out in the mud of the dooryard. What remained was mountain iron. "We'll use the horses to drag 'em down the ridge," Amos said. "Digging's easier in the scree field. I'll fetch the shovels," Josephine said. She turned back toward the cabin. She paused on the top step, looking up at the roof. "And Amos, yeah, while you're up there tomorrow patching that loose shake," she said, looking back over her shoulder. "You might as well check the chimney flashing. It draws poorly when the wind blows east." A tiny, almost imperceptible shift occurred at the corners of Amos's eyes. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest his face had managed in a decade. "I'll look at it," Amos said. He stood in the yard, holding the empty rifle, watching her walk back into the cabin. The secret was dead. The winter was breaking. And as Amos bent down to start dragging the bodies, he realized the silence of the mountain didn't feel quite so empty anymore.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, they sent the mountain man a shy bride, but her first night secret complete shattered him until dawn. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me was how quickly our understanding of someone can change when we finally learn what they've been carrying inside. It's a quiet reminder that patience and compassion can matter more than making quick judgments, especially when trust is still being built. How would you react if someone you barely knew revealed something unexpected? Do you think understanding should come before judgment? Maybe we can take that into everyday life by listening a little longer before deciding what we think of someone. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy Mountain Man stories like this, feel free to like and subscribe.